Okay, Steve.
Well, Marina, welcome to the session for our New Zealand libraries. I see people from the breadth of New Zealand, so from Wellington and Waimakariri and from Northwoods and South Island. So it's great to be able to bring it. We were just talking a little earlier about the benefits of a digital connection between people and being able to undertake things like this and bring in Heather and Adam from other parts of the world for their specialist views. I mean, equity of access has long been a common driver for libraries, whether it's been print originally and then into digital. But at the same time, the expectations of our digital native users, and now we used to talk about digital natives as something new, and now it's 20-something years worth. It's meant there's less tolerance for any barriers to that access. Simplicity of use, one click and no transition and waiting for resources to be available has become a base requirement for students and library users who operate in a world of multiple information feeds and on-demand services. The world has become more sophisticated at the same time in its attempts to exploit this huge and increasing amount of personal data that is accessible with the right knowledge and a breach of security, whether it's innocent or otherwise. Academic and medical sites have been using it. OpenAthens in New Zealand for over a decade. Siong, who's on the call, is one of the early adopters with their site in Auckland. The past few years, we've seen government and corporate sites follow in significant numbers as well. And certainly the academic sites are increasingly vigilant about data security. It's been highlighted with data breaches, but their quest has been to provide the best success across all of their students. And we're seeing the push by call towards this as well. On the flip side, our management of libraries and knowledge hubs are improving with much better tools to understand how and why, how and by whom resources are being used. For our OpenAthens clients, dashboard reports have helped transform many sites' regular reporting into snapshots that promote understanding of the library's role in an organisation, and also provide a starting point for more areas of analysis and investigation. But while we're looking to learn from data, we're all providing data to help transact our digital lives. Yesterday, I was talking through at a site, talking through the preparation of a presentation for an industry group of library managers. I was using provided access from one of our recent Auckland sites. So picking a site that was reasonably new with OpenAthens, but it's showing, look, this is what's actually happening now with the site. And the example I was providing was based on ease of access from a Google search into the library resources. So I'd found the journal I was looking for on Google, and through the publisher site, I signed into my library. So as I expected, when I returned, I was offered immediate download access rights for that subscribed resources on that publisher's site. But I was actually looking to recapture the process because the presentation I was doing was based on some screenshots rather than try and do this live. And the difficulty was I had to wait then for the session to expire, even though I was in incognito mode. So effectively, I set aside the presentation and came back to it actually a couple of days later to complete it. Now, the simplicity of getting to that resource and the ease of access and finding it, and also being treated as being in the library, and the librarian being able to see that I'd access to those resources and was making use of what I was subscribing to, that wonderful simplicity and ease was due to the tracking in the background of my activity. So with all that transactional ease comes a cost. I provided knowledge about where I've been with the digital world, not sensitive data, but enough for me to know and understand I'm being tracked, because when I go back in there, I can get access again. So we all need to be mindful of this and be aware of the benefits that they come with a caution. So it's great to welcome Heather. Her role in championing internet standards to protect users as her chair of the Identity Community Group is great, because she brings the fight to us to say, look, this is what we need to be aware of. And Adam, many of you will have been part of presentations and met him virtually in some of our previous sessions, who he's the go-to for technical stuff for OpenAthens, so glad to have him on board as well. So please put questions in the chat. This is about us understanding about how we manage both sides of the coin and providing that equity, but also protecting our users. So Heather and Adam, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Let me get some sharing going. We have slides, and hopefully you can use these as memory aids later. So there's a lot of ways that libraries expect to access, expect their users to be able to access online. By far, the most common is IP address authorization. It's often called IP address authentication, but there's a difference between authentication and authorization, and I can hop on that soapbox for a while, but that's not today's talk. Still, IP address is the most common way for sites to be recognized by the publisher. And traditionally, even though that's never what IP addresses were intended to do, it's been fabulous because computers were fixed, people were on campus, and there was no friction whatsoever to get there from here. Of course, then the world has changed. Things have become significantly more mobile. And tracking has become a significantly bigger issue. And so this is under more threat than you might think. Outside of IP address authorization, you've got username and password, local site information, and you've also got the identity federation, the SAML logins and whatnot. There are a few other options often used in the public library space, but they're very, very small, very small. So in academia, so the previous picture was more the general, the big picture view, taking it all into account. But when you start looking specifically at the academic science, technology, medicine, then you're going to see a bit more SAML and a bit more username, password kinds of logins, just the nature of this particular industry. In things outside, if you take academia out of it, then suddenly you're going to see a lot more of the library cards, the being, having refer URLs. You're going to see a lot more legacy material and how stuff is used. So the industry does matter, or at least the sector matters. But in all cases, you're going to see a lot of IP addresses. You're going to see quite a bit of SAML and a mixture of all sorts of other things. Is one better than the other? No, not as such. I won't go through everything on this chart, but suffice to say that everything has its trade-offs. Some things are easier to implement but harder to maintain. Some things have inherent privacy considerations and some things don't. Sometimes the maintenance is easy, sometimes it's not. What's the best option is better queried as what is the best option for your circumstance. And that will vary a whole lot depending on what you need to do, what risk factors you're concerned about, those kinds of things. So that's sort of the background to get you set up. I'm going to walk through a little bit more about, okay, so what's changing? And when I send up warning flags to say tracking is a thing, well, what exactly is tracking? Then we'll talk about a bit more of the, okay, well, things are going to change, but when? Everybody wants to know when, and where can we get involved? And my cat may join us. So a few things to just keep in the back of your head. There is a difference between browsers and the thing that supports the browser itself, the browser engine. Browsers include Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Large Cat, right? And then the browser engines underneath them include Blink or Chromium, Gecko, WebKit. Why do you care? You care because if you ever have support calls, understanding what platform the browser is running on matters, because the functionality is based on the browser engine, not the browser. Everybody that's using iOS or iPadOS are using browsers built on WebKit. WebKit does not support third-party cookies. Doesn't matter if you've downloaded Chrome to your iPad. It doesn't matter what you've done with Firefox. Depending on where you're coming from, you're going to get different behavior. Okay, but what problem are we trying to solve here? The problem is the big problem statement that we're looking at. Non-transparent, uncontrollable tracking of users across the web needs to be addressed and prevented. In the US, this is called motherhood and apple pie. Of course, this is the right thing. Everybody knows this is the right thing. Privacy, it's important. Tracking users, that's bad. Sort of. There's a corollary to this. Many of the applications and services that are being used to enable tracking are also used to enable federated login. It's the same tool. Think of it as all of these underlying features are like bricks. You can use a brick to build a house. You can use a brick to smack in a window. At the end of the day, what you have is a brick, and it's how it's used that has become problematic. So if it can be used for tracking, then it is under consideration for redesign. Of all the things that are under consideration for redesign, third-party cookies are actually the easiest thing to address. They are the highest on the list of features to be removed in favor of a privacy-preserving experience, and and some browser vendors have already done this. Now, I want to emphasize a point here that may be missed. When I'm talking about all of these features and how they're used and whatnot, my focus has been very much on the authentication and authorization component. These things are used for other reasons, absolutely. They are used to set preferences, for example, and that's out of my scope of worry. My worry is making sure that federated authentication still works. But if you have a learning management system, if you have a very large cat that wants to help today, if you have anything that involves a single page that brings in a bunch of different applications, then this is something that you're going to have to deal with. So a couple things to remember about all of this. The browsers, the people that are actually working on all of this, right? They come to this from the perspective of the consumer web. Social media, casual browsing, online commerce. They don't understand the government use case, the academic use case, the financial technology, healthcare. That's actually a bit outside their scope of knowledge. They focus on social media, and in the social media world, there's very few identity providers, right? Which is completely the opposite to academia, where you can have thousands. So let's talk a little bit about how does tracking happen. I'm going to make sure you understand what is a third-party cookie, what is happening with IP addresses, what's browser fingerprinting, what is link decoration, what is bounce tracking, what are all these things that are being used? So a cookie, not just something tasty with chocolate chips. You may hear these referred to as web cookies, internet cookies, browser cookies, or just cookies. There are different kinds, different flavors as you would. First-party cookies are set by a domain and accessible only by the domain that set it. So, for example, nature.com. If nature.com sets a cookie that only nature.com can read, that functionality is not going away. But if nature.com tries to set a cookie that springer.com can see, even though that's actually the same company, that's a third-party cookie. A third-party cookie is accessible to any site, doesn't matter who set it. And it's the third-party cookies that are, I won't even say under consideration, but that are going away. IP addresses. So these are used to identify machines or services on the internet. I'm not even going to say on the web, but on the internet. They're used to make authorization decisions in libraries most commonly, but also in things like ERP systems. Link decoration. This is a feature that it's a feature available in the web today that allows a site to add just a touch more information for sometimes perfectly legitimate reasons. If you have a query string, that's going to be very often included in your URL. You can usually recognize when that additional information is being added because you'll have the URL string. In this case, we've got something from sspnet.org. But when you get to that question mark, that's the signal for more information has been added. Another reason you would do this is to set an authentication token, something that says this user is authenticated. This is the token that verifies that information. Perfectly legitimate. You can also use it for tracking. One of the more common things you may see is where it says method equals, and it's tracking how did this person get to my site because you clicked on a link in your email. And so when it brought you to the site, it's now storing, yeah, this was a successful click from our marketing campaign. That's what they want to know. Browser fingerprinting, it's like a little bit of all of the above because it's information that's being collected about the hardware and software on your system. So I tend to use Firefox, and I have configured Firefox to my own personal needs. Set to expire my history in a certain amount of time, certain plugins that I prefer to be used, certain fonts that I find easier to see. You put all of those together, and that's stuff that, of course, a website would need to know a certain amount of those things because it impacts how things are presented. It can ask, and the browser is likely to tell them. And you add that together, you throw in an IP address, and suddenly you've got a very unique fingerprint of a specific browser that can then be tracked if there's a marketing firm involved, pulled to a central database, and then they just watch what site you go from site to site to site to site. This is a very, very common way to track what a user is doing and present advertisements or other things to them over time. But wait, there's more. There's also something called bounce tracking or redirect tracking. And this is something that's often used. This is used for a couple of reasons, valid and less valid. On the valid side, it's used by a common authentication technology called OpenID Connect to validate that the session information between an identity provider and a relying party is valid. But it's also used by trackers to get around the third-party limitations. So many browser vendors have tried to control the issues of tracking by saying, well, if the user has actually visited the site, then it's probably okay. They probably meant to do that. Well, some enterprising soul decided that, well, if I just set 1 pixel to redirect to the site and come back, then that counts as a visit, right? Yes, it does. And so this is something that they were using to get around the, well, it's no longer a third party. If you visited the site, it's now a first party and everything is okay again. Darn. So at this point, I'm going to hand off to Adam, and he's going to talk a bit about, well, what does this mean very specifically for federated access to content online? Adam.
Hello, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm trying to make this less OpenAthens specific and more industry sensitive. So next, please. The highlights, the short version, is federated access. It basically, in our context, we're talking about SAML-based authentication, authorization, communication. Federated access does mean a slightly different thing, but in this context, we're talking about SAML-based authentication services, single sign-on systems. And in theory, it shouldn't really be too affected, at least for the next 2 to 3 years. Next. There are some exceptions. So whilst single sign-on should still function, because typically they're setting first party cookies. When you log into Shibboleth or OpenAthens or some other IDP like Azure, that system is logging a cookie. If you use that to then log into Nature, Springer, Science Direct, EBSCO, those services set first party session cookies to recognize that you're logged in. So in theory, that isn't going to be affected unless somehow it's kind of classified as like those tracking redirects, but I find that unlikely. Single logout, however, will be affected. So any services that if you click log out, it then logs you out of all other things, that will no longer be possible because that effectively uses third-party cookies. Personally, rather than professionally, I think that's a good thing because I'm not overly fond of single logout. When you're trying to get single sign-on to things, just means you've got to log in over and over, as we've got a few internal services. Anyway, I digress. WAIF services. So what I mean by that is, where are you from? The institutional or organizational login services. So when you go to a vendor and you want to log in with your credentials, your institutional or organizational credentials, you basically need to search for your organization. Now, those will continue to work. The way they're designed, they don't overly use cookies to find an organization, send the user to the login point. But the exception is the persistence layer around that. So things like Seamless Access, Wayfinder, the more advanced integrations where they're, say, embedded on a vendor's website, they effectively use third-party cookies because it's not a Nature Science Direct cookie. It's a Seamless Access, Wayfinder, or other discovery service type cookie. So whilst it might not remember the previous organization that you had previously logged in as, you'd still be able to find the login point. So authentication and authorization, logging in, shouldn't be affected, just the persistence of last used organization. Actually, before I move on, the other point to that is discovery services, WAIF services, there are numerous different types. I mean, anyone that's ever done any bit of research knows that the login experience is very different. And there are central discovery services where the user will be redirected to a central organization search. Those will remember because they're setting first party cookies. It's only really the embedded ones that are shared services, but embedded on certain sites where it won't be, it won't remember the organization. Yes. Services that share information between third parties in frames, like iframes, they will be more than likely affected. You're going to have mixed results. Certainly if you try and use Teams in think it's Safari, basically won't work because of the way it's sharing, and it's who knows what you're sharing. So therefore it's designated potential tracking. It's in scope for being stopped. So slide please. So that, oh, I thought there was another piece. So that could affect things like ILSs, LMSs. If you're say pulling in loads of widgets that are pulling data from other third-party services, those might be affected. So it may start affecting your library portals, ILS, LMS integrations with other third parties. Yeah, so other features like the IP-based recognition authorization potentially are already breaking in some browsers that are not sharing the user's public IP address. So especially if you're using i+, which is an Apple subscription-based thing, that will not present IPs. So therefore, your on-campus IP recognition type thing could potentially go away, as in not supported. But for federated access, for things like proxy services, that's unlikely to be affected because of the nature in which they operate. Wafeless linking, Heather mentioned about link decoration. So that's the query strings. Wafeless links, so if you don't want to go to a waif, a find your organization thing, and you want to provide a link straight to an article, a journal, a database, an ebook, from your library page, from your discovery service, integrated with a link resolver, usually they're configured to use some form of wafeless link, so that it not only takes you to your login point, but also then straight to the particular article. Now, because of the nature in which those links are created, they use link decoration. So that's the question mark, a parameter, ampersand, another parameter. And in the same way that you click a link in an email campaign and it's got that tracker, well, there's nothing really to say at this stage, this is used for good use versus this is used for tracking. So therefore, those types of linking could break in the future. Cookies currently, what's the current state of play? So Safari block third-party cookies by default. So if you want to try and see what the landscape would look like without third-party cookies, you can try now with Safari or indeed Chrome or Firefox, because you can disable them manually, but Safari have them disabled by default. Firefox it's a block list or a blacklist. So they're not blocking all third-party cookies by default, but they've effectively got a central list within their backend system that has a bunch of domains blocked, so that those cookies will not be registered within Firefox. Chrome, at the time of writing, this was like March, I think, early this year, Chrome was planning on phasing third-party cookies out sort of mid-2003. In their blog, they've kind of updated, it's going to be, was it the second quarter, the second to last quarter of 2024? So mid to late 2024, they will effectively be phasing out third-party cookies. So similar to Safari, making them blocked by default. When third-party cookies are gone, when they are disabled, single logout will break, which isn't too big of a deal for most people, because not all services support single logout anyhow. But for those that are used to clicking logout, knowing it will log you out of XYZ application, that will change going forward. So if third-party cookies are blocked, single logout will not work. Yeah, OIDC and OAuth features will break. That we mentioned about the iframe stuff, front channel logout, session management. I'm a little bit hazy on the detail of that, I have to be honest, but from anyone using Keystone, an OpenAthens service, from our research, it doesn't look like that will be affected because it is all back channel stuff. But anyone using, I don't know, OIDC to connect, to log in to other things, that might potentially be affected depending on the implementation. IDP persistence. So this is going on about the WAIF pages, those organizational discovery pages. Like I mentioned before, a central discovery service where effectively the vendor hands off to a central discovery service. That central discovery service will remember the organizations you've used previously, unless you clear your cookies. But because that's stored as first-party cookies. But any vendor that is integrating an embedded version, an advanced integration of, say, Seamless Access or Wayfinder, where they've got the organization discovery in their site, but are using a third-party discovery service, those will still function, but the IDP persistence, the identity provider that they previously selected, will not be remembered. So you have to search for your organization each time, but you'd still log in. I sort of touched on this. Yeah, so if you want to emulate how this would work in the future when all of this stuff's turned off, well, you can just go into your browser and turn it off. Safari's got it turned off by default. So anyone with a Mac, use Safari, try and use the internet, and you'll see what does or doesn't work. But if you are a Apple user, you're probably used to the new way of working already, because that's been disabled for quite some time now. With Chrome, you can go into your settings. I think this is a screenshot from my computer. I've had third-party cookies blocked for, I don't know, years, because I'm not a fan of tracking, and I am a fan of privacy. So I have had that turned off for, as I say, years, and it has not really negatively affected me. There's a few quality of life things that you just learn to live without, but on the whole, everything I need or want to do, I'm capable. But yeah, just go into Chrome, turn it off. I don't have a screenshot, but you can do the same in Firefox. I'm confident you could in Brave and any other browser that you've got, but just turn off third-party cookies. IP addresses. If you want to see how the world reacts when your IP is not made available to a vendor, at the moment, you'd need to subscribe to iCloud Plus, which is an Apple subscription. But that does, I don't want to say block your IP. Every computer, every machine, every device on the internet, not just the web, but on the internet, needs some form of IP in order for routing to happen. But what they do is they mask the IP. So instead of presenting the public IP of wherever the user is, whether they're on campus, in the library, in Starbucks, whatever, it will effectively assign an anonymous IP that would mask the public one. So think of it as almost like a proxy in a way. Slide. I think that's all I need for that. Now, Seamless Access have been involved in all kinds of things trying to help improve the user journey, the all-round experience of library services presented to end users, etc. And there is an FAQ specifically about these browser changes. Now, I think it's worth sharing with anyone who is interested, because this will affect IT, library, faculty, users, vendors, anyone. So the key thing about this webinar is information dissemination. What we wouldn't have wanted is, I don't know, 2-3 years down the line, all of a sudden, I can't think of an analogy that isn't swearing, so I won't. But yeah, oh my goodness, what's gone on? So that's what we're doing, trying to forewarn that things are changing. It's not 100% concrete precisely what else might be affected within federated access management, but this is a heads up that there may be some changes, either around deep linking, quality of life, or indeed authenticating into content. But check out that FAQ, and do attend the working group, which I don't think we've got a link to, but we can circulate after. Apple and Mozilla don't really provide a timeline per se. They don't have a roadmap, but Apple have already done stuff. Like I mentioned, they've done the IP thing on the subscription level thing. It's a block on the IP. Third-party cookies are blocked by default. Potentially, the blocking of IPs may make it into the general ether, as in for normal people that aren't subscribing to this extra service, but there is no timeline or commitment for that. Mozilla, again, no timeline, but they have moved ahead. They're not quite as far as Apple, but they're further than Google. Google do actually have a timeline, so they've got effectively as a roadmap, their timeline for all kinds of different things, and that at the moment is looking mid to late 2024. Now, I would first, before we open it up to the floor, I'd just like to ask Heather if she would like to add anything.
Yes. So one of the things that makes all of this important for you to know is browsers are feeling a whole lot of pressure to do something. They are being held liable for enabling tracking to happen, which means that where browsers used to be just a passive actor in how content got to the users, they're now feeling the pressure that they have to do something. Not doing something is not an option. And thus all these changes happen. The best thing that this community can do is not figure out how to stop the changes, because that's simply not tenable, but to figure out, okay, well, what can we do differently? Can you get engaged in the standards and figure out, well, can this standard change to do something to signal that this is an actual authentication event? Because right now the browser doesn't know, it can't tell, it does not see that. One could argue that maybe it shouldn't, because often the authentication events are encrypted. But that's why we present this, to get people familiar with what's going on, what's changing, why things might suddenly stop working, why their experience of being pestered with more questions of, user, are you really sure you want to do this? What about now? Now? Are you sure? That's going to happen, and we want you to understand why. So that would be like one of the thoughts I would want to leave you with. This is to help you know what's going to happen and understand that it's not going to stop happening. All right, I think we are open to questions.
Thanks, Heather. I've had my question answered, which was what was that IP address? What was that address for the fax? So everyone can see that now. Adam's put it up. Are there any more questions?
While we're waiting for those, a little bit of information behind that FAQ. I wrote that with a pair of librarians so that it should be quite readable, but it should also be something that you share with your networking team. There's a link in there provided by Apple as to if you're finding the iCloud plus IP address blocking obfuscation to be problematic, there's a way for your campus to say, take me out of that and make sure that the IP addresses in our range are shared. So there are some mitigations for you. I see the iCloud Plus stuff is kind of a warning shot across the bow. None of the other browser vendors are doing that today. But when one browser vendor does something, the others do try and figure out how to maintain market share and parity. So will they actually go that way? I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. Any other questions?
I think it was quite technical for some of us. And I'm sure that people will be like me, will be watching it again. But it certainly made me very aware that we do need to consider this for anyone that's managing some information system, online information system. So I think that's very helpful. Are there any questions from anybody? Russell, I may have missed this point, but lots of focus on Safari, Chrome, and Google. What about Edge?
So Edge is actually a browser that's built on Chromium. So basically, it's got the same underlying engine as Chrome itself does. And having been in direct conversations with the Edge team at Microsoft, there has to be a really compelling reason for them to do something other than what's in that base browser engine that, while open source, is primarily maintained by Google. They'll do it, but that means that's something that they have to support in-house, and the less they have to do that, the less expense they have in that space. So when I think about this space, I just classify Edge as being in the same family as Chrome.
Great, thank you, Heather. Any more questions? Janice has said it's good information. Thank you very much. That's great.
A pleasure. It's a pleasure. This is stuff that I live and breathe every single day.
Oh, that's fabulous.
So I'm always happy to talk about it.
I am going to go. I've got a question. I did. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I did pick up that there was, if you put in links to articles, you know, like that were stored on another site, that those may break in future when things change. What might we need to do? Because as a comms person, I do this a lot. Mm-hmm. What would we have to do to still get the links in there somehow?
Well, first I'm going to direct you to that FAQ because I think that will help you a lot in understanding what the pieces are. The other thing I would say is those links are generated by something. More often than not, you're using a tool to create like a waveless link or a proxy link or some kind of link that brings people back to your library space. The vendor of that tool should be extremely aware of what's happening here. You might want to open up a conversation with them because they're going to be your first line of support to help make sure that this continues to function as your users need it to going forward.
Okay, so you need to be extremely aware about what you're linking to. Yeah. Okay.
I think where it gets complicated is
because it wasn't complicated enough.
indeed. But so if all the link decoration stuff does go away, it's one of those things that each and every vendor ultimately will need to redevelop their websites, because even if they're not supporting waveless linking, most of them, if you look, have some kind of, well, I say most of them, I'm thinking of Ovid, like they've got query strings here, there, and everywhere. Yeah, certainly around waveless linking, seamless linking to content, that will most likely involve vendor development of their redevelopment of their sites to do something else other than query string stuff. But maybe there is stuff that link resolver companies can do to figure out weird and wonderful ways to do the authentication to link in. My suspicion, which I shouldn't be saying as a supporter of federated access, but if it were to happen tomorrow, I think there would probably be a lot of uptake of proxy-based services, would be my suspicion. So the industry needs to get a handle on it, basically. Certainly people like me in a sort of federated authentication world, we need to work with vendors, with link resolvers, with our own product teams to figure out ways to do this.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how important it is for the vendors to be involved in the process. Think of it this way. It's the difference between being part of the solution so that you know it will work for you versus being presented with a solution and you just have to do it and make it work, whether it's a graceful fit or not. One may take more research and development time, which is something I know is very precious, but the other one is a business risk in terms of, is your product still viable in the market?
Okay. We've got a question here. How does the IP register fit in with this international repository used by publishers for access to their journals?
I don't know a whole lot about that one. Adam, are you up to date on IP register?
Yeah, so the IP registry from PSI is similar to Ringgold. It's basically a big source of data about organizations, namely IPs. So the vendors, instead of, oh, you would like to subscribe, okay, please give me the IP of your site. Well, they don't need to do that. If they sign up to the IP registry, if someone subscribes, they can just get the IP and automatically enable access on their end. So the good thing is they're starting to include federated details in there, not just IPs. So vendors could use stuff for the federated authentication, not just IP. But to the point, if the IP is blocked within the browser and it is no longer visible, as in the public IP, just my IP from my machine on my network, wherever it is I am in the world, that will not function. So that means you couldn't do straightforward IP recognition for on-campus access. But what you could do is, to my knowledge, what the browsers are doing, it will still mean you'd be able to use a proxy service, because that effectively masks the public IP within the browser, is how I understand it. So I don't think IP recognition is completely going away, but straightforward, I'm on this network type thing will not go away. Will go away, but proxying and VPNs, I think, will still be possible. Is that right, Heather? Or do we not really know yet?
Probably. I think the bigger question is, and they know that IP addresses are used for tracking. It's more often not used by itself, though. It's part of a browser fingerprint more often than not, again, from a tracking perspective, not from an authorization perspective. And there are projects out there trying to figure out how to narrow down what information is shared when a site says, I want to know what that browser is, what it's doing, what it looks like. I want to know the fingerprint. How exactly that will look to an end user, I don't know.
Okay. I feel like I've got to go and read those FAQs and digest before we set our new website up next year. Are there any more questions? It looks like we may well have come to the end of the questions, and I think that everyone like me is digesting all this information, and it's been extremely useful. Thank you very much, Heather, Steve and Adam. And thank you to EBSCO for enabling LIANZA to hold this webinar with you. It's been very useful, and it will be on our YouTube channel, and we'll once that's up, we'll send that link out to everyone that was registered, because we know that there's at least another 80 or so people that will be interested in this information. And I can see that everyone's saying that they've appreciated this, and thank you very much to everyone. It's been fantastic of you. I really appreciate it, and appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise in this area. And I'm just going to close with a karakia, the closing karakia for the event. So thank you again. Anuhia, 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 kiti uru tapanui, te wātia kia mama te nākau, te tinana te wairua e te ara tangata, koia rā e rongo, whakairia aki ke runga, kia tina, huie, taikie. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Robert Daggs, in the background for your help in facilitating everything to this to happen. I'll leave you all today. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.